Out west, the wind doesn't carry secrets, it buries them. This is the story of a woman named Joanna, who came with nothing but a knife and a name no one trusted, and a man named Silas, who spoke little, but saw everything. What brought them to get? Let's ride back in time, to the day her wheel broke and nothing was ever the same. Dust rose in lazy ribbons as the stagecoach limped into the whispering sands of Colorado, the wheel snapping with a dry crack that echoed against clay-burnt cliffs. A gust of wind thick with grit swept through the canyon pass. Bison Pass locals called it. Evening sun painted the dust in tawny gold. Joanna Hale tumbled out of the coach like a rag doll, landing hard on her knees. The fabric of her old velvet dress snagged on the rim of the carriage, tearing ragged strips across the grainy ground. She rose shakily, chest heaving. No tears. She didn't cry anymore. Ahead lay nothing, no homestead chimney, no saloon light, just low hills breathing dry grass under a reddening sky. Joanna's gaze was fixed on a horizon, as empty of promise as it was vivid in last light. Then he appeared, a silhouette, stepping from the haze boots, stirring dust, broad-brimmed hat, crooked over dark, steady eyes. In one hand the reins of a horse, in the other an old Spencer repeating rifle. The figure's stillness was unnatural, half dream, half omen. Joanna blinked, disoriented. The world shifted. Her heart pounded. The man said nothing. Only the wind answered, whistling through cracked leather. He nodded once, acknowledging her. Then, wordless, he guided his horse closer. Joanna pressed her back against the broken wheel, seeking a measure of safety. "I'm looking for a place west," she said finally, voice sand rough and low. "A place far enough away." Her eyes swept him warily. He made no move to respond. She cleared her throat. "You. From Red Bluff. You won't make it to Red Bluff before nightfall," he said. "And you don't want to be out here after dark." He didn't say it like a threat, just a fact carved out of weather and years and knowledge of the land. Instead, he turned and began leading the mare toward where the coach lay, tilting into a dried gully. Joanna followed, boots crunching on dust and broken twigs. "Coaches fit for fixing?" she asked, arms crossed. He glanced at the wheel with an expression buffered by twilight. Then, without a word, he walked past her toward the horse again. She caught a glimpse of a creased black duster, the sheen of perspiration on a calloused neck. He waited for her to mount behind him, pressed close enough that her pulse thrummed under his back. The horse moved with equal parts grace and caution, stepping over rutted granite as they rode. Joanna gripped the saddle horn, wind catching at her hairpins. Behind them, the coach sat broken, the silence growing. They reached a low ridge where light drained from the world. He turned off the rough trail, onto a faint path that wound toward a cabin perched against the far hillside, smoke drifting into dusk. Joanna's mouth felt dry but safe, and she resisted looking back. She pressed her lips tight around a warning, but the question rose anyway. "You're not helping me out of pity, right?" she challenged, voice half curious, half sour. He glanced at her. No answer. Only the rhythm of his horse's step and the hush between them, like the pulse of a dark lake. They reached a weathered cabin, a squat hunk of rough timber, with a sagging porch. Inside, a small hearth glowed enough to melt the chill settling in her joints. The air smelled of dry pine and old smoke. Silas Merrick removed his coat. Its front pocket sagged with stories unhulled. He hung it by the door and unstrapped his Spencer. Joanna watched his hands steady. He lifted the coat toward the fire. A single envelope fell, yellowed and stiff. Joanna's breath caught. "What's that?" Silas stared at it, inert in the firelight. Without meeting her gaze, he let the coat fall to the floor. She held her breath. He yanked his coat off the hook, turned it inside out, and retrieved the letter. Viscous dust floated in its wake. No postmark, no return address. Only a name on the flap, faint but unmistakable, Joanna Hale. "What is it?" she murmured. Silas slipped into the shadow's envelope folded against his chest. The flickering fear caught his collarine. His voice was low, clipped by caution. Just something I found 6 years ago. Spanish Peak stagecoach ambushed. Dead driver mailbag lying open. Name got my attention. Joanna stared at the envelope, stunned. Her thoughts did a dizzying spin. Why had he kept it? Why now you ever read it? She forced herself to ask. Voice dry as chalk. Silas shrugged, expression opaque. Wasn't mine to read. The cabin door cracked open behind them, wind skimming the boards. They stood silent, the letter dangling between. The last rays of sun died beyond the horizon. Joanna swallowed heart tight, and the name lingered in the half-light, written in ink more stubborn than history, Joanna Hale. Silas watched the way her fingers trembled. He'd seen that name for 6 years. But tonight, it finally looked back at him. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a longing, or just a breath of quiet truth, don't forget to subscribe. Here every week, we ride back into forgotten corners of the American West, where love isn't loud, but it lasts. Where stories aren't perfect, but they matter. So pull up a chair. There's always room for one more around this fire. The cabin was warmer than she'd expected. Not cozy, no place built by one man, and 4 walls could ever be that, but steady, grounded. Joanna hovered near the stove, watching as Silas Merrick poured water into a dented kettle, his movements economical, quiet. He didn't speak much, just worked in silence. He stacked more wood into the firebox, and the blaze crackled to life, licking shadows into the corners. The smell of pine sap, mixed with old leather and a hint of tobacco, lingered in the air. Joanna folded her arms tight across her chest, not because she was cold, but because she didn't know what else to do with her hands. Her boots were still dust-crusted from the road. Her dress, faded green velvet, was too fine for a place like this, but worn thin at the seams. She felt the ridiculousness of it, like an itch under the skin. Her eyes drifted to her own reflection in the darkened window pane. Hollow cheeks, wind-chapped lips, and hair pulled back, so tight it gave her a headache. Silas handed her a tin cup. Coffee. Strong. Bitter. Thanks, she muttered. He nodded once, sitting across the room facing the fire, but glancing at her from time to time. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was thick, like steam rising off wet earth. She wasn't sure if she wanted to fill it, or let it be. The flames popped. Joanna winced. Sorry, Silas said, not for the fire, but for something else unspoken. She shook her head. It's fine. But it wasn't. Nothing was. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the cup. Burns lined the side of her left palm, old shiny scars like melted wax. Her collar was uneven, stitched by hand, the work of someone unpracticed or in a hurry. It told a story without needing to. She caught Silas looking at it. What she snapped. He didn't flinch. Nothing. But the way he looked, steady, unfazed, irritated her. Like he saw too much and judged too little. She stood up, restless. The room was too quiet, too clean. She paced near the fire, set her cup down harder than she meant to. He moved toward the hearth to check the woodpile. The moment he stepped close, her hand flew instinctively to her boot. In one swift motion, she pulled the small knife-free blade, glinting in the firelight. Silas froze, not alarmed, not angry, just still. She held the blade between them, jaw set. Back off. He didn't move, didn't speak, just nodded slowly, eyes never leaving hers. Good, he said, voice calm. You should be ready for worse, she blinked. The air between them shifted. Joanna lowered the knife after a beat, slid it back into her boot. She wasn't sure what had embarrassed her more, her reaction or his lack of one. You think I'm crazy now, she muttered. Silas turned away, crouching to place another log on the fire. I think you've had to be your own guard dog for a while." She stared at his back, at the way his coat strained over solid shoulders, at the calm in his spine. "No one else ever offered to stand watch," she said almost to herself. Silas poked at the embers. "You're here now. You made it through the pass. That doesn't mean anything. It means you didn't lie down and quit." She exhaled a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "They called me a liar back in St. Louis." He glanced up, brow furrowed slightly. "They said I made it up. What happened?" She swallowed. "But I never lied. I just didn't fight." He didn't ask what happened. She liked that about him. No digging. No gentle prodding disguised as care. "Sometimes surviving doesn't look pretty," he said. "Sometimes it's just showing up. That counts too." She sat back down, hands still shaking slightly. The coffee was cold now. She didn't drink it. Rain began tapping at the roof in soft, inconsistent rhythms. Outside the world blurred dark silhouettes of pine and hill, dissolving into one another. Inside, the fire hissed as a drop hit the stovepipe. They ate in near silence. Dried meat beans and a crust of bread too hard to chew without soaking in the broth. Joanna chewed slowly, chewing more than she needed just to keep her jaw moving. Silas didn't speak unless necessary. She appreciated that. They sat across from one another, not close, not far. Like two strangers waiting out a storm in a shared shelter. No questions, no expectations. Just breathing the same smoke-warmed air. When she finished, she stood dusting off crumbs from her skirt. She moved to the wall hook, pulled off her damp coat, and held it near the fire. That's when the room noticed. Her blouse pulled taut across her back, lifting slightly as she stretched. And just beneath the shoulder blade, rising pale against her skin, a dark bruise yellowing at the edges bloomed like spilled ink under parchment. She didn't notice the way Silas looked at it. Didn't hear his breath catch just slightly. She didn't offer an explanation. And he didn't ask. The rain deepened outside, steady now. Inside the cabin, the fire glowed low, and the only sounds left were the crickets of flame, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of two people choosing for now not to speak. The town of Red Bluff wasn't much. Just a handful of buildings leaned up against the wind, with plank sidewalks too narrow and windows too dusty to reflect anything clearly. But after Bison Pass and 3 nights of storm-battered sleep, it felt like the edge of civilization. Joanna walked in with her chin up, even if her boots were sore, and her pride hung by a thread. Millie Bexley, owner of the Copper Lantern Saloon, spotted her before she even reached the door. Millie stood with arms folded across her apron, her steel-gray hair wrapped in a tight bun, and her eyes sharp as a nail. "You're not from here," she said flatly, blocking Joanna's path inside. Joanna offered a neutral smile. "Just passing through." Millie snorted. "That's what they all say until trouble sticks to their boots." Still, she stepped aside. Not kindly, just out of habit. Inside, the saloon was dark and slow, smelled like old beer pine smoke and men who worked harder than they talked. A few heads turned, but not many. Joanna moved to the counter and asked for water. Millie raised an eyebrow, but poured her a glass anyway. She hadn't even finished half when she heard the voice. "Well, I'll be damned, Joanna Hale." Her spine stiffened. She turned slowly, carefully, already knowing who it was. Porter Vance stood with a silver-tipped cane and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He looked finer than anyone else in the room, tailored vest, gold chain at his pocket, and the kind of boots that hadn't seen dust in months. His teeth were white. His tone was sweet. But his eyes were mean. Joanna gave a polite nod. "Porter." "Well now," he said, stepping closer. "What brings you this far west? Thought you'd run out of roads. I don't owe you answers." "Maybe not," he said with a laugh. "But I do like surprises, sis. You've always had a way of showing up where things get interesting. People at the bar were starting to glance over. Millie's gaze was sharp from the end of the counter, but she said nothing. Porter leaned in slightly. You know folks don't forget faces like yours. Even out here. Joanna stepped back. Don't test me. He raised both hands in mock surrender, still smiling. Oh, come now. Don't be shy. Tell them how we knew each other. Good friends we were. Her hands balled into fists. That's not how I remember it, she said tightly. Porter chuckled. Well, memory's a tricky thing. But I remember you fine, Joanna. Real fine. And with that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving behind a silence that stuck to her skin like sweat. Outside, the sun glared too brightly. She walked too fast until she reached the edge of town. Her chest burned not from exertion, but from fury, directed at him, at the way he twisted truth into poison and dropped it where others could drink. She didn't see Silas until he stepped into the street ahead of her. You all right? He asked. She didn't answer, just brushed past him. He followed. You ran into someone, he said flatly. She stopped, turned. You know him. Silas's jaw worked once before he said enough. Then why didn't you say something in there? She snapped. Why let him talk like that? Silas didn't flinch. Didn't want to light a fire in a saloon. She stared at him hard. Sometimes silence burns worse. He didn't respond. Just watched her unmoved. She hated that she couldn't read him. Hated that he didn't offer comfort or explanation, only that same quiet weight that made her feel seen and invisible all at once. Whatever she muttered, turning back toward the trail. I don't need you to fight for me, didn't say you did. They walked in silence. Not close, not far. That night the wind picked up. Joanna stayed in the cabin's front room, curled on the bench with a blanket over her knees. She didn't sleep. Not fully. Silas moved about the yard until late, checking the fence line, latching the barn doors tight. A routine maybe. Or restlessness. It wasn't until just before dawn that she smelled the smoke. Sharp, acrid, wrong. She bolted upright, heart pounding. Silas had already flung open the door, rifle in hand. Flames curled along the edge of the shed dry boards, catching fast. The fire hissed like it knew what it was doing. Silas dashed toward it, dragging a tarp, stomping embers, throwing dirt. Joanna ran with buckets from the barrel. Together they worked in harsh rhythm, no words, just breath and motion. By morning the fire was out. The shed half gone. Tools scorched. Smoke still rising in pale ribbons from blackened ground. Silas stood with hands on his hips, breath ragged. Joanna coughed, wiping soot from her arms. Was it lightning? He shook his head. Sky was clear. She waited. But he didn't say more. His eyes drifted toward the trail, toward Red Bluff. She followed his gaze. Porter. He didn't confirm, didn't deny, just stared at the horizon like it had insulted him. Joanna said nothing more, because some silences didn't need filling. The smoke had not yet cleared from the ruined shed when Silas stumbled through the door of their hastily erected lean-to. Jonas Merrick. No, Silas Merrick stood there, with a bruise blooming across his ribs from falling timber. Blood darkened his shirt beneath the smoke-gray dust that clung to his skin. Joanna rushed forward, hands shaking as she lifted his arm. You hurt badly, her voice cracked, torn between relief and fear. Silas made a sound low in his throat, half grunt, half chuckle. Nothing broken, he said, just stupid pride and splinters. She stifled a sob as she stripped the tattered sleeve away, using water from the kettle and damp cloth to clean the wound bleeding just beneath the surface. Joanna worked in silence, her hands steady, despite the chaos in her chest. Every lathered cloth felt like penance. When she was done, Silas sat up and winced as she applied a simple salve mixed with pine resin and ash. It smelled like home. You should sleep, Joanna said, voice soft. I'll lie here, he said. You already did more than enough. But Joanna didn't move. She leaned against the canvas wall, every thought drifting to darkness and joy. He might have collapsed there, broken, exhausted, if she didn't break the silence. Porter said things that people heard them. Everyone thinks there's a story. Silas closed his eyes. She waited. At dinner, she said, eyes brimming. He said, she swallowed, I was asking for it. That I gave everything to him for some promise. And when I couldn't deliver. Tears glistened, careless and raw. Silas said nothing. My father, she whispered. He looked at me like I was poison. My mother. She never stopped crying. Silas's hand lifted and hovered above hers. She didn't flinch. She let his fingers rest there. I'm not a virgin, she said, voice flat and brittle. The words hung. They weren't whispered. They were carved into the air. Silas exhaled slowly. His fingers pressed into her knuckles. He didn't look away. I never asked you to be, he said quietly. The calm in that statement shattered every expectation. Joanna's chest tightened. She shook her head slightly, blinked back tears. I'm not what you think. She paused, words tangled in her throat. You're not your past, Joanna. His voice was steady, not warm, not cold, but real. You're who you fight to be now. She stared at him, breath caught between tears and relief. Their shoulders almost touched. Neither moved nor pulled away. For the first time, Joanna didn't feel alone. The fire's glow flickered across their faces, painting hope in orange candlelight. They stayed like that for long minutes. No questions, no demands, just presence. Then Silas shifted, reaching into his coat. Joanna's breath caught as he pulled out the envelope again, weathered, dust-streaked, with the name faintly visible under the dim lamp. It's got your name on it, he said. He placed it in her hands. Her fingers trembled so hard the paper buckled. Why now? Her voice was soft, broken. Silas's gaze met hers, steady and full of something she couldn't name. Because I needed to know it belonged to you. Clara, no. Joanna stared at the envelope. Her world tilted. And as she opened it, the page inside caught the light, ink pulse, but unmistakable. By dawn, the charred timbers of the shed had cooled, and a thin mist hovered over the scorched ground, like a halo of smoke. Joanna knelt by Silas's side as he stirred the coals to warmth. His injury cleaned and bandaged, but the ache behind his ribs still stubborn. I should have saved more, he murmured, brushing ash from his fingers. She shook her head. We did what we had to. He nodded, and silence embraced them again, a quiet undisturbed by firelight or pain, but ready to be shattered. Joanna held the envelope Hal had given her, finally able to look at it without trembling. Her name, blue-black on yellowed paper, felt heavier than any letter she'd ever held. She opened it, hands steady now. Inside was one page of fine script. My dear daughter, I believe you, my daughter. But I couldn't stop them. I'm sending this west in case you ever find your way back. Yours always, Margaret Hale. Joanna's eyes blurred at the sight of her mother's hand. Years of bitterness. The hole left by absence, the sting of betrayal, all unraveled in that pale ink. Her breath hitched. A tear traced through ash, dusting her lashes. Her mother had tried. She had believed. The letter was never meant for Silas. It was meant for Joanna. But Joanna never received it. Silas cleared his throat gently. It was a raid, he began, voice soft. That stagecoach near Bison Pass. The rider died beside the horses. I stopped, found the mailbag. Torn letters scattered. Your name stopped me cold. Joanna stared at him, the revelation opening something wide and raw. I never opened it, Silas said. Felt wrong if it wasn't mine. She swallowed. Why keep it all those years? His gaze met hers. Just the name felt familiar. They both stopped, letting the weight of the past settle between them. The world outside was waking up slowly. Inside, something fragile stirred. From the trail came footsteps. Joanna stiffened. So did Silas. Porter Vance walked in without knocking. His coat, pristine clean for riding, looked out of place amid scorched wood and damp air. Mr. Merrick Porter greeted, voice smooth. I hope the night was kind. Silas stood. Joanna followed. Porter's gaze found Joanna's pale outline before landing on the wound visible beneath her shirt. He nodded in understanding. I hear the cabin had a fire. A pity. Such a fine place. Silas did not respond. Porter inclined his head. I have funds to offer, fair price for land and cabin. A coal mine needs expansion. Silas's eyes darkened. We don't sell land at a stroke of an offer. Porter's smile didn't falter. Coal is money. I'm offering peace. Prefer agreement to conflict. Joanna stepped forward, voice low but clear. You didn't come here to talk about peace. Porter's eyes flicked to Silas. Just visions of progress, Miss Hale. Silas brushed back his dust-streaked hair. Progress built on bricks of someone else's ruin isn't worth much. Porter smirked. Quaint notion. He turned to Joanna. Money will make people forget. Joanna's chest tightened. She glanced at Silas, who held her gaze with unbroken calm. Silas crossed his arms. He picked the wrong land to steal. Porter's smile sharpened. Think it's still yours to defend? Silas glared. You'll find out. Porter tipped his hat. Time will tell. He strode out. Silence thudded in his wake. Joanna exhaled. At Silas's side, she felt something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Safe. The letter fluttered in her hand, fragile bridge between past wounds and future hope. They stood there together, the burned cabin the only witness. Dusk settled over the land in copper tones as Joanna and Silas worked side by side on rebuilding the cabin. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and resin, but their hands were steady. Each post raised, each roof plank replaced felt like they were stitching their lives together from the ashes. Silas held a heavy beam in place while Joanna pounded a spike into rough timber. Her arm trembled, but she hammered again. Each strike echoed through the lean-to they'd made their home. It wasn't just carpentry, it was prayer, effort, devotion. Millie Bexley arrived with a basket of damp rags, jerky, and a flask of simple whiskey. Joanna paused, wiping sweat from her brow. Thought you could use this, Millie said, handing Joanna the jerky. She eyed Silas working beside Joanna. Strong hands. But strength will only carry you so far. Joanna accepted the food, cautious. Thanks. Millie stood watching the half-built cabin. Men like Vance always think the world owes them. Don't let him buy your silence again. Joanna's chest tightened. Millie gave her a look made of steel and years of watching men forget how to feel shame. Later, Joanna sat by the riverbank, quill in hand, writing. The letter, Margaret Hale's letter, was now folded and sealed within her own note. At the town hall, Joanna placed the stamped envelope in the drop box. Inside her complaint, she included the original mother's letter, along with a statement detailing Porter Vance's threats, his attempt to buy her silence, and the arson at Silas's property. Filing it formally was slow justice, but it was justice in law, not gunpowder. Word spread quickly. Porter's name was whispered. Joanna trailed bow by the river, gazing at the rising crescent moon. That night, angry voices shattered the quiet. Joanna raced home to find Silas and Deputy Harlan wrestling two men on the hillside near the barn. A few more lay groaning in the brush. Harlan glanced at her, breath ragged, but determined. They came for him. Silas glared at the attackers, then at Joanna. He hired them. The next morning, Silas and Joanna returned to the cabin. Both were bruised, neither spoken for hours. Their shared silence was a promise. Under the late afternoon sun, Silas capped the final post of a high, sturdy fence stretching yards from the cabin. Dawn to dusk, they'd rebuilt not just the cabin, but a boundary that said, "This is ours. You do not get to take it." Joanna stood beside him, hands on hips, watching him lightly tap the final nail. The sun laid dust gold on both their faces. She swallowed hard, met his eyes. "This time no one's taking it from us." Silas laid the hammer down, leaning against the post. His gaze swept over the fence and the land beyond. "Then we best build it strong." They stood there together, backbone to backbone, the fence between them, as much a bond as protection. The only sound, the whispering wind through tall grass, carrying seeds for futures yet to come. A month had passed since the tension of rebuilding and threat attacks, common as the creek flooding at spring melt, but the air had grown sharp, the mornings, carrying a taste of frost. Joanna sat by the window, stitching a wool scarf, its stitches neat, deliberate. Each loop around her needle echoed the circuits of their new life, careful, patient, warming itself stitch by stitch. Outside, Silas knelt by the orchard, planting new plum saplings in lines he'd marked the day before. Earth crumbled under his fingers, cold but promising. The trunk stood pale against the snow-dusted grass. He paused, wiping a bead of sweat, and paused to look across the yard where Joanna worked beside the hearth. He didn't offer marriage. Not yet. Because in this cabin, they didn't need a ceremony, only the certainty that each dawn, 2 mugs of black coffee would sit on the table waiting. Later, Joanna heard the soft rasp of visitor. The postman came, knowing the people here understood how important each envelope could be. From him came a letter bearing the seal of the county courthouse. She didn't say a word. Slipped it onto the mantel near the photograph, Margaret Hale's portrait, yellowed but steady looking back. The postmark was clear. Porter Vance was under investigation. Allegations of arson, coercion, and attempted intimidation now sat in cold official ink. She tucked the letter away without announcing it. Some victories weren't for celebration. They were reassurance that truth, no matter how delayed, still mattered. Night fell, and they settled by the hearth. Silas cupped hot mugs between both hands, steam whispering upward in thin plumes. "I had a brother," Silas began quietly. His voice rode the rhythm of the flames. "He used to say he wanted a place where women didn't need to ask permission, just to live." Joanna lifted her gaze. His eyes held firelight and years of unsaid grief. "He died before I came west," Silas continued, voice low. "Left me with the land and the promise to make sure someone belonged." Joanna pressed her lips together, holding the mug warmly. Neither said, "I love you," but the words floated in the yellow glow of the cabin actions instead of promise. They lingered in silence, cradling their cups, listening to the sigh of wind in the cottonwood branches beyond the window. Hours passed. Snow faintly began drifting outside, covering the ground in trembling white. Inside all was still, but for 2 mugs, emptied warmth lingering in their palms. Joanna finally stood, walking to the window. Her breath made soft white ghosts on the glass. On their land, the fence stood solid, the orchard saplings curled in sleep. Silas took her shoulder from behind unannounced. She leaned into him. This time they didn't need words. Everything had been said in mornings, in the letters, and in the steady rebuilding of home. They didn't need a vow or a title. Only the land, the fence, the cabin, and the steady hands that built it together. Perhaps you've been like Joanna, walking down old roads carrying a wound no one could see, and a question no one ever quite answered. Maybe you've stood at a drafty doorway, wondering if you still deserved a place to call home. But like Silas once said, you're not your past. You're who you fight to be now. If you've ever searched for something steadier than broken promises, then maybe you'll understand why a plain cabin fence built by hand and 2 coffee mugs on the table could mean everything. Because some love doesn't come with fireworks or rings, but with the way someone looks at you, like you've never been left behind.